So, for those of you who haven't heard, the New York Times put out a piece over the weekend where it's basically advocating for continued censorship of right wing voices, and it's their model of going after places like YouTube where there's independent content creators because it's actually the direct competition for the mainstream media. So, I wanted to go through this article with everyone. You won't see my picture here. This is the article as it is seen on the New York Times website. Something that's important to remember is not only was this placed on their website, but it was actually front page of some of the papers that they sent out over the weekend. So this was a huge story that they worked on. And I want to point out just how atrocious this article is. And I feel like instead of just talking about bits and pieces, it would be best to go through the actual article. I'll give my opinion on it, but I'll also link it and you'll be able to see it all here. We'll go through the entire thing and give my comments on it so you can see for yourself just how bad it is. So let's start at the beginning. What you're seeing here is exactly what the page opens to when you click on the link. It says, Caleb Cain was a college dropout looking for direction. He turned to YouTube. You see that it says New York Times, and it has a bunch of pictures here. And these are all people that he had viewed on YouTube at times. Now, some of them might be considered more alt-right than others, but there's a question of even some of the ones that are shown if they're actual white supremacists. So you see Steven Crowder there, Gavin McInnes from the Proud Boys, Milo Yiannopoulos, Stefan Molyneux. But then you see other, and I don't think, by the way, I'm not smearing any of them as alt-right or racist or anything like that. I'm just saying at least those are figures that you could see on the right. You see other figures that you wouldn't even say that about, though. Like Ben Shapiro certainly couldn't even be considered alt-right. He's Jewish. He gets hate from them. You see people like Philip DeFranco. You see Dave Rubin, people that wouldn't be considered right-wing at all. And so it just shows that it's a hodgepodge. Right out of the gate, we can see with the text, he turned to YouTube. Something nefarious is going on. All of these characters must be nefarious characters here. But it turns out that's garbage. And if you know any of these personalities, you can see that. So we'll scroll down a little, and it's kind of like an interactive graphic here. Soon he was pulled into a far-right universe, watching thousands of videos filled with conspiracy theories, misogyny, and racism. So I guess these people that they have listed left here are the far-right people, the misogynists and racists they're talking about. Ben Shapiro, for example. I mean, it's just absurd. They smear these people without giving any evidence of their misogyny or racism. And it's a guilt by association thing. Not only are they not talking specifically about why the people they mention are racist, but then they put people like Ben Shapiro in there with them. Keep scrolling down. I was brainwashed, says Caleb. This is by Kevin Roos. Now, they put this little blurb you can see here in the light gray text. It says, a sampling of more than 12,000 videos that Caleb Cain watched going back to 2015. Many, but not all of which were from far-right commentators. Well, one of the reasons they put that was there was actually criticism levied by a lot of these people saying, like Philip DeFranco, like, hey, New York Times, I'm not even right-wing, let alone far-right. Why am I included in this? So they put this little blurb to clarify. That clarifies nothing. And first, how many people read that little blurb? Second, it still says many of which were far right, so you're still being smeared. And it's just, it was intentional. They could have removed that graphic and removed those faces. They could have put any comment there that said, these are specifically the far right commentators we're discussing. But no, instead they allowed that intentional smear. Caleb Cain pulled a Glock pistol from his waistband, took out the magazine, and casually tossed both onto the kitchen counter. Now, right out of the gate, this is very interesting, the way they're spinning this. It's designed to get clicks. It's designed to get your attention. Far right, radicalization, YouTube. First sentence, this guy pulls out a pistol. This guy that was brainwashed. What's he going to do with this pistol? Does he rob people? I mean, surely he's a racist now, right? That's the implication that he was with the far right, misogyny, racism. He pulls out a gun. Well, as it turns out, when you read through this article, one of the hilarious things about it is Caleb Cain, the very person they're talking about being radicalized, never does anything that untoward. The worst it says is he considered himself like a tech conservative and had arguments with friends. He didn't use this gun for nefarious purposes, did he? Yet they lead with that because they know most people just read the sensationalism that's at the beginning of articles or the titles. I bought it the day after I got death threats, he said. The threats, Mr. Cain explained, came from right-wing trolls in response to a video he had posted on YouTube a few days earlier. In the video, he told the story of how, as a liberal college dropout struggling to find his place in the world, he got sucked into the vortex of far-right politics on YouTube. So he bought the gun for defense. So this guy, who we're now going to know is a left-wing commentator, at least he recognized the utility of self-protection in the Second Amendment. which is kind of ironic. But nonetheless, let's go on. Let's see what they say. I fell down the alt-right rabbit hole, he said in the video. Mr. Kane, 26, recently swore off the alt-right nearly 5 years after discovering it and has become a vocal critic of the movement. He is scarred by his experience of being radicalized by what he calls a decentralized cult of far-right YouTube personalities who convinced him that Western civilization was under threat from Muslim immigrants and cultural Marxism, that innate IQ differences explained racial disparities, and that feminism was a dangerous ideology. Okay, so let's talk about some of this. None of these things, and the problem is when you start to say that we can't discuss an issue because it leads to you being misogynist or racist or something like that, what you're doing is you're censoring data, you're censoring real discussion. And as we'll see later in the article, that has the effect of actually driving people to extreme positions such as this. If you're really concerned about racism and misogyny, instead of advocating for the censoring of those voices, you would allow them to speak, as long as they're not advocating violence or breaking laws or something like that. When you allow them to speak, it encourages actual debate and people to respond to them so you can see the absurdity of those positions. Instead, you censor, drive them underground, then people don't have a chance to debate them, and some people say, geez, maybe these arguments are being censored for a reason. Furthermore, none of these things they list, particularly to me, seem like they automatically would make you a terrible person for wanting to discuss or believe in. Such as, is Western civilization under threat from Muslim immigrants? Now, I've defended on my channel Muslims many times. Some of the Muslims I know are fantastic people. There's definitely a sect of people that are Muslims that are problematic. I don't think being concerned about that, particularly if you're talking about things like Rotterdam or other things of terrorism that's being brought to countries such as those in Europe, that necessarily means you're a terrible person for being concerned about it. No more than I would say anyone who's talked about the recent Catholic sex allegations is a bigot against Catholicism. No, maybe they're just interested in actually solving what they see as problems in that community. That doesn't mean you're bigoted towards them. Cultural Marxists, yeah, I talk about them all the time. They are a huge problem. The mainstream media, just one example, the mainstream media slandered a bunch of kids that were wearing MAGA hats because they wanted to defend a black Hebrew nationalist that were yelling racial and homophobic slurs at them. And a Native American gentleman who thought that those black Hebrew nationalists had a good point and was telling those kids harsh truths. They smeared those kids to the point that they got death threats, and then they smeared them more by trying to connect them to actions that occurred over 5 years ago at their school before they were even in attendance that, oh, by the way, was also misconstrued by the media. That's cultural Marxism. That's saying that black adults, in this case, were okay to make racial slurs at white children because cultural Marxism, because blacks are oppressed. That's just one example. So yeah, it is a problem. It is worth talking about. We weren't allowed to point out the absurdity of the Covington situation. That's what the New York Times is advocating. To discuss those type of things means that we're leading to radicalization. Not them encouraging people to go after white students, white kids, to the point where they were getting death threats and the media kept going after them afterwards. That's not the radicalization. Oh, no. Not when we saw the Twitter people, the blue check marks that endorsed the media's kind of attacks on these kids, saying to put the kids in wood chippers, that they would blow them away and things like that. No, they had punchable faces. No, that wasn't the radicalization. It was the people responding saying, this is sick, that's grotesque. That was the that's what the New York Times would have you believe. IQ differences, it's not something I talk about often because I don't have a knowledge of it. But I don't have a problem with people discussing data. I don't think that makes you a racist. My intent is, even though you could point to some communities that have, on average, a higher IQ than others, one, we never judge people in the collective, ever. And second, that could be explained by all sorts of things like cultural, or like economic backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, and things like that, which could raise IQs in certain communities. I don't know, it's not something I talk about, but to just say we can't have those discussions is dangerous. You can have discussions talking about data points, and that doesn't make you a bigot. Now, you could be a bigot and try to use that to buttress your bigotry, but that doesn't mean you're a bigot by just talking about those things. Feminism's a dangerous ideology? Yes, it is. Again, this is another thing. We have to listen to them say men are evil, toxic masculinity, violent patriarchy, overthrow it, use violence if necessary. Men are disgusting pigs. We have a culture that's basically punishing boys in schools. You see people like Christina Hoff Sommers, who are herself a feminist, by no means a radical right-wing person. One of the videos listed that they talk about, which I'll get to later, is Karen Strawn, also a woman who's talk specifically about kids being boys being bullied in school because of these feminist ideologies? Yes, that's important to talk about. So in other words, they're allowed to smear a gender. They're allowed to advocate for violence or the overthrow of the country. That's not radical. But if you talk about that and why it's bad, then you're engaged in radical ideology. The truth is, you could be a feminist or anti-feminist and not be radical at all. You could be making salient points. That's what we should want, a debate. But you start to see how they're going to smear people throughout this, exactly the angle they're coming from. Let's continue. A quote from Kane, who's, again, the gentleman who, that's his picture there on the right, that is saying that he was radicalized. I just kept falling deeper and deeper into this, and it appealed to me because it made me feel a sense of belonging, he said. I was brainwashed. Over the years of reporting on internet culture, I've heard countless versions of Mr. Kane's story. An aimless young man, usually white, frequently interested in video games, visits YouTube looking for direction and distraction, and is seduced by a community of far-right creators. Well, geez, they hit all the high points there, right? All the tropes they needed to hit. Gamergate, let's blame video gamers, right? He's white. Oh, that's dangerous. He's going to YouTube and he's seduced by far-right commentators. What does that mean? Again, when we get to the end and we see Mr. Kane's full story, yes, he says that he was brainwashed, but now he's a member of the left. So instead of watching YouTube's videos on the right, he's watching, as YouTube basically admits, the equivalent of the left. So, of course, he's going to say what I was before I was brainwashed, of course. And so what is this countless stories we've heard? A bunch of people that like right-wing commentators happen to be white and played video games? Okay, what's the danger of that? That would be no different. You could post an article to say that about any ideology and make gross stereotypes. I would think that would be something that the New York Times and this author would be against. For example, I could put, Antifa, the majority of them are wealthy white people that live in their parents' basement and watch Young Turks videos. And CNN videos, and Rachel Maddow videos. Does that mean the Young Turks or Rachel Maddow need to be smeared as possibly endorsing all the things that Antifa does? No, absolutely not. As far as I know, even though I heavily disagree with a lot of what they say, they're not endorsing violence, and they shouldn't be linked as such. You can see how this is only going one way. You could take any cross-section of any group, take a specific person from them, any group, I don't care, Republicans, Democrats, Constitutionalists, Green Party, Communists, and you can find extremists in them. If we want to slander a whole group based on those outliers of the extreme, we could do that with any group. This, by the way, is not just designed. It is a large part designed to smear the right wing, as you can see, and all the other groups they want to go after. People that have problems with feminism, people that have problems with cultural Marxism, people that were into video games, white people. But it's also designed to go after the New York Times and the mainstream media's competition. That's what the Vox Adpocalypse is about, primarily. YouTube and independent content creators are putting the mainstream media out of business. They're getting more clicks. They have more factual news reporting than most of these terrible mainstream media outlets. And the mainstream media is routinely losing viewers and money, and so they have to go after the competition. Moving on. Some young men discover far-right videos by accident, while others seek them out. Some travel all the way to neo-Nazism, while others stop in milder forms of bigotry. How about some never become bigots whatsoever? Again, the problem is, and I talk about this in a lot of my videos, is defining terms is very important. So far-right, for example, what do you define that as? Who's far-right? Ben Shapiro? Look, I like Shapiro. I disagree with some of what he says, but certainly he's not advocating bigotry. Certainly he's not advocating Nazism. So they just say, like Dave Rubin, who's someone who's a classic liberal. He's been on the left. They talk about the intellectual dark web. That's people like Christina Hoff Sommers. That's people like Brett and Eric Weinstein. These are left-leaning people. Yet they're being considered, they're lumped in as far right, and that leads to, there's two options once you start watching them. You're a neo-Nazi or you're doing some milder form of bigotry. That's absurd. That's defining terms to smear your opponents. Moving on. The common thread in many of these stories is YouTube and its recommendation algorithm. The software that determines which videos appears on the user's homepage and inside the up next sidebar when the video is playing. The algorithm is responsible for more than 70% of all time spent in the site. The radicalization of young men is driven by a complex stew of emotional, economic, and political elements, many having nothing to do with social media. But critics and independent researchers say YouTube has inadvertently created a dangerous on-ramp to extremism by combining two things: a business model that rewards provocative videos with exposure and advertising dollars, and an algorithm that guides users down personalized paths meant to keep them glued to their screens. Now remember, when you're hearing this, and there's going to be a lot of talk of the algorithm, I won't spend too much time on it because I don't understand like how the algorithms work so much. That's not my tech expertise. But remember, when they're complaining about these algorithms, that YouTube is their competition. So let's look at the mainstream media in the same vein that they're saying that we should look at YouTube here. A model that rewards provocative videos and ones that algorithms guides users to see other provocative videos, basically. Couldn't you say the exact same thing about the mainstream media? The mainstream media awards provocative. That's why you see all the liberal mainstream media talking about Trump, 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 2 scoops of ice cream, Trump's a Russian, Trump's a spy, P stories, Stormy Daniel, Michael Avenatti, right? That's why that was provocative. So they're engaged in the same thing. The New York Times itself, where this article is coming from, is engaged in the exact same thing. Even with this article, by the way, the Covington kids, remember that debacle? Jussie Smollett, remember that? The Kavanaugh coverage, remember that? Provocative garbage. And instead of an algorithm, they purposely choose what to advertise and what shows on their channels to advertise and the types of stories to advertise. And guess what? It's provocative garbage. So they're actually engaged in the same thing. What they're really saying is, we're upset that another platform decided to take our thunder and try to encourage provocative videos, provocative content, and recommend other provocative content that's not the mainstream media. That's what they're saying. Moving on. There's a spectrum on YouTube between the calm section, the Walter Cronkite Carl Sagan, and Crazy Town, where the extreme stuff is, said Tristan Harris, a former design ethicist at Google, YouTube's parent company. If I'm YouTube and I want to watch more, I'm always going to steer you towards Crazy Town. True, but isn't that... I mean, that's not necessarily true, but sure, okay, I could take that argument. Let's take it. Again, doesn't the mainstream media do the same thing? Why is it that we don't see, like, more debate-style programs anymore? You know, where people are having calm, civil, rational debates. We don't see the Walter Cronkites, do we? We see the Rachel Maddows. We see the Don Lemons. We see the panels on CNN with 11 people that all agree that Trump's a bigoted racist who's a Russian agent. Now, they put a little segment here. I'm just Bill, but I'd like to be Jill, and I'm demanding bathroom access at will. It's from I'm Just Bill, a transgender Schoolhouse Rock parody by Steven Crowder. Steven Crowder, you might know, is the conservative comedian who also deals with politics, is huge, or really big on YouTube. He's the one that the Vox commentator Carlos Maza said he was insulting me, he's hurt my feelings, he needs to be taken off. So let's see the little blurb they say about him. Steven Crowder, a conservative commentator, notice they don't say comedian, has gained nearly 4 million subscribers like Mr. Kane with shock jock antics like this parody, which drew from the widely recognized Schoolhouse Rock cartoon. Okay, so SNL continues to have shocking skits that go after people that call them names. Stephen Colbert called Trump's mouth Putin's C holster. Samantha Bee called Ivanka a feckless C word. Isn't that all similar things? Why is it only a problem when the right does it? The left's allowed to engage in satire, mocking, name-calling, profanity. Even beyond that, they're allowed to advocate for using physical violence, like Carlos Maza himself said, milkshake them all. We don't want conservatives to feel comfortable to be able to assemble in a public square. That's all okay. New York Times isn't writing anything about that. But Steven Crowder having a joke skit, somehow that's dangerous? I forget who said it, but they say inside every joke's a tiny revolution. That's true. Even comedians I don't have a problem with Stephen Colbert making fun of Trump or any other group, even if they're, even if I would consider what they're doing to be distasteful or to be offensive. That's fine. If I don't like it, I'll change the channel. But the truth is, a lot of times, even with people you disagree with, comedy's a good way of saying, okay, I can kind of see your point a little more. So you might be for transgender rights. There are many people who are not bigots whatsoever, feminists in fact, that think that a lot of the transgender movement's going too far, such as transgender people competing with women in athletics and doing very well. So what are they trying to say here? Again, it's just these flashpoints. It's just code words. It's trying to code to you, just like this stuff fire in your brain. Misogyny, racism, Nazi, Steven Crowder, Dave Rubin, Joe Rogan. It's just trying to throw that all, radicalism. He put a Glock on the table. But it means nothing. A friend of mine told me this is like the satanic panic business back in the 90s. Moving on. In recent years, social media platforms have grappled with the growth of extremism on their services. Many platforms have barred a handful of far-right influencers and conspiracy theorists, including Alex Jones of InfoWars, and tech companies have taken steps to limit the spread of political misinformation. Well, one, yes, as many of us said with Alex Jones, if you cheered for him getting censored, and for what, being a conspiracy theorist, well, then he's just the first line. They'll come for more. Now we see they are. They're trying to go with all these content creators, particularly those on the right, but also anti-establishment left-wing voices. You see people like Jimmy Dore, whose channel gets demonetized a lot, many others. And now you're seeing people like Joe Rogan, Dave Rubin. They're going to be the next to come over, more like a centrist that just are willing to talk to people on the right and the left. Stopping the spread of political misinformation? Geez, before the New York Times and Vox and the mainstream media cast those stones, perhaps they need to look at themselves, who spread 2 years' worth of lies about this Russia P dossier and claiming that they knew that Trump conspired with Russians in a criminal way, or the Covington story, or the Kavanaugh story, or the Jussie Smollett story. I could go on and on. Why no talks of the stopping and spreading of political misinformation on those sites? It only seems to be that it goes one way, only towards independent content creators or small fries on social media, and mostly those that have, quote, misinformation that's against the establishment left. YouTube, whose rules prohibit hate speech and harassment, took a more laissez-faire approach to enforcement for years. This past week, the company announced that it's updating its policy to ban videos espousing neo-Nazism, white supremacy, and other bigoted views. The company also said it was changing its recommendation algorithm to reduce the spread of misinformation and conspiracy theories. So let's take the top part. They're going to stop neo-Nazism, white supremacy, and other bigoted views. YouTube put out a list of things that they would consider issues that you're not allowed to basically be confrontational about. So sure, race, religion, that makes sense, right? You think, okay, no big deal. But remember, they're the ones controlling that. They have selective enforcement. It was no problem for people to, say they want to kill all white people. It's no problem for people to mock Christianity. If it was, how's South Park still allowed on there? They make fun of Jesus. Of course I don't want to see South Park censored. It's a funny show. It's comedy. But you see my point. If belittling based on genders and misogyny is not allowed, why are all these rap songs allowed? So it's the selective enforcement that's the problem. Also, one of the areas they say are immigration status. So now if you have a problem with illegal immigration, for example, that could be considered a bigoted view. You see how the defining of terms, now it's bigoted to have a problem with illegal immigration. I'm not a bigot at all. I think some of the greatest Americans are legal immigrants that came from different countries, that work hard, respect this country. I don't care if in 30 years that white people will no longer be the majority of the country. Don't care at all. It means nothing to me. I don't care about the skin color people, but I do have a problem with illegal immigration, as do many legal immigrants that happen to not be white. But now they too will be considered bigoted. To reduce the spread of misinformation and conspiracy theories? Doesn't that sound a little Orwellian? So now, these massive tech groups, in conjunction with the mainstream media that they're taking their cues from, we know that the mainstream media is in bed with the intel agencies and with the government in many senses. So now basically you have a pipeline where a bunch of oligarchs are telling you what information you're allowed to say without being censored. Want to criticize the Vietnam War? Might not be possible in the future. Had a problem with the Gulf of Tonkin incident? Sorry. You think that we want more information about the gassing in Syria? Where there's now evidence that actually it probably wasn't Assad that did that? You're anti-war? You don't want to see bombs just flying without proof? Sorry, you're a conspiracy theorist spreading misinformation. You need to be silenced. Where will those voices be heard then? They're not heard in the entertainment and all of our areas of cultural influence. By that I mean establishments that kind of set the public discourse. So that would be academia, the mainstream media, the entertainment industry, and now Silicon Valley. If they're all in agreement and all coming from one area, kind of at this point, the establishment Democratic area, and again, it is a lot of right-wing people being censored, but we're also talking about left-wing people that don't go along with that establishment, which should scare everyone, even if you don't like the right wing. Anti-war type people, the Jill Stein type people of the war, the Jimmy Dores, the Aaron Mateys, Glenn Greenwalds. And me saying that is not an endorsement of everything those people say. I want free speech for everyone. So that's what this is shaping up to be. That's what they're advocating for. You have opinions we don't agree with? Shut up. You're not allowed to speak. With 2 billion monthly active users uploading more than 500 hours of video every minute, YouTube's traffic is estimated to be the second highest of any website behind only Google. According to Pew Research, 94% of Americans 18 to 24 use YouTube, a higher percentage for any other online service. Geez, any reason the mainstream media would be worried about that? Their direct competition is dominating. That's what they're trying to tell you here. Might be a justification for smearing them and writing an article like this and advocating an adpocalypse like Vox is doing. Moving on. Like many Silicon Valley companies, YouTube is outwardly liberal in its corporate politics. It sponsors floats at LGBT pride parades and celebrates diverse creators, and its chief executive endorsed Hillary Clinton in the 2016 presidential election. President Trump and other conservatives have claimed that YouTube and other social media networks are biased against right-wing views and have used takedowns like those announced by YouTube on Wednesday as evidence for those claims. Yes, and again, you see people like Ben Shapiro and other right-wing commentators say this all the time. When conservatives do something bad, that's the story. When there's a liberal doing something bad, the story is conservatives pounce. So yes, they admit, basically, all these tech companies are ran by people that are outwardly liberal. And I wouldn't even say that. I think liberal is a misnomer. Liberal people are for debate and free speech. I think they're outwardly leftist, establishment democratic followers. That's what I think they are. But the right wing's upset about it. Yeah, they should be. Everyone should be. You shouldn't be for censorship. You shouldn't be for yellow journalism like this, just attempting to smear people with sensationalist headlines. Remember how it started? He put a gun on the table. Bunch of pictures of people trying to smear them all as misogynist neo-Nazis. In reality, YouTube has been a godsend for hyperpartisans on all sides. It has allowed them to bypass traditional gatekeepers and broadcast their views to mainstream audiences and helped once obscure commentators build lucrative media businesses. Well, isn't that kind of a little coded, funny message? I remember when I was taking journalism classes in university, and one of the things that many left-wing and liberal people talked about was the idea of these wealthy gatekeepers, these 6 corporations that controlled all the mainstream media that were gatekeepers to the public knowledge. They're right, that is a problem. That's one of the great things that the internet gives us the potential to do. It eliminates those gatekeepers. Yes, there will be problems. Without gatekeepers, there will be disgusting people on fringes of all sides. But that price is worth it, so that all of us could have a voice, and so that we're not controlled by a small handful of people that happen to be extremely powerful. Basically, what the New York Times is saying here is, we want to go back to when we were the gatekeepers and people didn't have information that we didn't provide. It's also been a useful recruiting tool for far-right extremist groups. Bellingcat, an investigative news site, analyzed messages from far-right chat rooms and found that YouTube was cited as the most frequent cause of members red-pilling, an internet slang for converting to far-right beliefs. A European research group, Vox Poll, conducted a separate analysis of nearly 30,000 Twitter accounts affiliated with the alt-right. It found the accounts linked to YouTube more often than any other site. First off, I've heard red-pilling to not necessarily mean linking to the far-right. Red pilling often means, and again, I understand with terms like this, it could mean something different to everyone. But they just assume anyone who's saying red pilling means that you're far right. That's not true. If I was to use that term, what it means to me is someone who I thought was kind of on the far left, who now has woken up and realized that that's not a good thing. For example, Dave Rubin, people say, has been red pilled. Joe Rogan, people say, has been red pilled. They're not even right wing. They've been red-pilled to understand that this kind of establishment progressive ideology of like identity politics and censoring and keeping certain viewpoints out of the public square is bad. That is what the term red pill means, at least to me in that context. Also, when they say alt-right, red pill, far right, when they're making these terms, what do they mean by that? They say them as if they're absolutely factual, but then when you see, how do they define it? Well, constantly you see the media trying to say that Ben Shapiro is alt-right or far right or Dave Rubin. And we know that's not the case. So we have to take a grain of salt when they're citing research companies that talk about how many people are on the far right and alt-right. They can't even define it. They think anyone centrist and to the right is far right. Moving on, YouTube has been able to fly under the radar because until recently, no one thought of it as a place where radicalization is happening, said Becca Lewis, who studies online extremism for Data and Society. Data and Society, by the way, put out a garbage chart or article that had all this garbage linking people to the far right that was just totally bogus. Made up facts, made up statistics. And they were outed for it. Yet they're still quoted in the New York Times as if they're factual. Further showing the shadiness of this particular piece. Facts don't matter. They'll go to someone who's been proven to be infactual on this very subject as long as it allows them to smear the competition. But it's where young people are gathering their information and entertainment, and it's a space where creators are broadcasting political content that is, at times, overly white supremacist. That's true. There are content providers that are overly white supremacists. The problem is when you cry wolf and say everyone on the right is white supremacist and start to say groups like Dave Rubin and Joe Rogan, even if you talk to someone who's a white nationalist, then that must make you a white nationalist. No, that's absurd. Debate is good. That's how you beat ideas like white supremacists. Also, funny, they only talk about white supremacy because there's all sorts of other bigotry on there. But because of the cultural Marxism that they endorse, and by that I won't go into the definition thoroughly, but basically they label certain groups as oppressors and oppressed. The oppressor groups they have no problem allowing to be bigoted. So it's okay to be bigoted against white people. You can smear a bunch of white children from Covington Catholic High when a bunch of black adult racists yell at them, and that's okay. That's not considered dangerous, whether it be the mainstream media or YouTube allowing that content. So keep in mind, they're only looking at the extremism from one side, and that's ridiculous. As we can see, look at the recent spate of, for example, people in MAGA hats that are being beat. And yes, I know someone on the left will say, yes, but there could be violent Trump supporters too. Of course, but if you're interested in honest journalism, you wouldn't just focus on one section of that. Moving on. I visited Mr. Kane in West Virginia after seeing his YouTube video denouncing the far right. We spent hours discussing his radicalization. To back up his recollections, he downloaded and sent me his entire YouTube history, a log of more than 12,000 videos and more than 2,500 search queries dating to 2015. These interviews and data points form a picture of a disillusioned young man, an internet-savvy group of right-wing reactionaries, and powerful algorithm that learns to connect the two. It suggests that YouTube may have played a role in steering Mr. Kane and other men like him to the far-right fringes. It also suggests in time YouTube is capable of steering them in very different directions. But what does that mean? Any content is. Comic books could steer me, at this point, with their recent focus on LGBT, comic books could steer me to transgender radicalism. Does that mean we need to crack down on DC and Marvel? No, of course not. It's an absurdity. Mainstream media could steer you to physically assaulting Trump supporters, seeing as how they say things like wearing a MAGA hat is a symbol of bigotry and racism. Does that mean that we need to censor the mainstream media or have articles from the New York Times about that? No. Isn't it funny how they always talk about, steering people to extremism or incitement of violence, but they never look in their reflection in the mirror? They have no problem discussing how advocating for a certain politician makes you a bigot. They refuse to cover the stories that show the bigotry to them. And even when we see actual, children, for example, in the Covington case, being slandered by adult racists, they take the side of the adult racist and help with the slandering of the children. Where's their self-reflection on that? Now, here's a chart. Here are the number of political videos Kane watched each month. You can see, I'm not going to read the numbers exactly, but I will read the comments. The right-wing content Mr. Kane viewed in 2015 and 2016 consisted of videos by Stefan Molyneux, with titles like Social Justice Warriors Always Lie and The Global Warming Hoax. Okay. Is that bigotry? I can see, for example, the mainstream media say Trump always lies. Trump supporters are stupid. I saw Don Lemon have a guest on that said Trump supporters are one-toothed rednecks. New York Times doesn't really have a comment on that, right? Global warming up. So, that doesn't make you a bigot. There's a lot to discuss with global warming. People that just say it's settled science, move on, then what they do is they then take that to the further extreme. Yes, I do believe that I will concede that there probably is settled science, that climate change, man-made climate change exists. But there's all sorts of questions. How much is man responsible for? How bad will the effects get? How long do we have till those effects happen? How much can we do now to change to be able to solve it? How fast do we need to be able to change to be able to solve it? How much money will that take? What are the best ways to do that? Etc. There's tons of discussion to be through there. Just saying, anyone who has questions of any of that must be a liar. No. And they have to be censored. That's some form of bigotry. That's absurd. Mr. Kane also watched many videos by members of the so-called intellectual dark web, like popular comedian Joe Rogan and political commentator Dave Rubin. Yeah? Have you ever watched Joe Rogan or Dave Rubin? They bring people from the left, the right. Dave Rubin, in fact, just had an excellent video with Andrew Yang, who's a Democratic contender for president. Yang understood the utility of going and discussing someone to get your views out there on different platforms. Dave Rubin himself isn't right-wing. Neither is Joe Rogan. Dave calls himself a classical liberal. Joe, I don't know that I've seen him put a label on it, but I think he's left of center. And the intellectual dark web, the only people in it that could even be considered right-wing are Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro. Brett and Eric Weinstein, like people at Quillette, Dave Rubin, Heather Hine, Christina Hoff Sommers. These are all left-wing people. Maybe someone like Jonathan Haidt would be in there. Left-wing people. Yet they're being smeared. Now again, the issue is the smearing of these people anyways. You shouldn't smear Stefan Molyneux without proof. If you have proof of specific things that you think that he said that you have a problem and think that they're bigoted, then show your proof. But to just smear him and say, he had videos titled The Global Warming Hoax, okay, that doesn't mean he's a bigot or far right or some kind of danger at all. That's bad enough on its own. It's also bad to then smear and put people like Joe Rogan and Dave Rubin like they agree with Stefan Molyneux. So one, you make the fallacy of assuming just because someone says things you disagree with, they must be a bigot or a misogynist. And second, you take people that clearly don't even agree with that person and say, well, they must agree with them because one random person watched both of their videos. How is this a news story? It's transparently an attempt to smear people, to go after the competition, which is YouTube, and to smear independent content creators that are the biggest competition to the mainstream media. During 2017, Mr. began watching more videos from left-wing channels. Okay, so then clearly he wasn't brainwashed beyond redemption, even under their interpretation. Then the bottom, it says, includes the views of YouTube channels Mr. Kane viewed 10 times or more between mid-2015 and late 2018. Now, some more about the person. I'll fly through what I don't have much to say about. From an early age, Kane was fascinated by internet culture. As a teenager, he browsed 4chan, the lawless message boards. He played online games with his friends, devoured videos of intellectuals debating charged topics like the existence of God. There was an internet escape. Mr. Kane grew up in post-industrial Appalachia, was raised by conservative Christian grandparents. He was smart, shy, and socially awkward, and he carved out an identity in school through intellectual punk. He went to community college but dropped out after 3 semesters. Broken, depressed, he resolved to get his act together. He began looking for help on YouTube. One day in 2014, he gets a video by Stefan Molyneux. Like Mr. Kane, Mr. Molyneux had a difficult childhood, and he talked about overcoming hardships through self-improvement. He seems smart and passionate. He wrestled with big questions like free will, along with practical advice on topics like dating and job interviews. Molyneux describes himself as an anarcho-capitalist who has a political agenda. He was a men right activist who said that feminism was a form of socialism and that progressive gender politics were holding young men back. He offered conservative commentary on pop culture and current events, explaining why Disney's Frozen was an allegory about female vanity, or the fatal shooting of an unarmed black teenager by a white police offers proof of the dangers of rap culture. Okay. All I want you to do is look at that paragraph there. Take out the word Mr. Molyneux, insert the name of some famous feminist, and say, this feminist who describes herself as a feminist has a political agenda. She's a woman's rights advocate that said that the patriarchy is a form of oppression and that it was holding back women. She offered liberal commentary on pop culture references like why movies and stuff are all misogyny, or why the raping of women was a result of the patriarchal culture. Is that radicalization? Because that's what feminism is. It's not just on YouTube. That's what you hear in actual courses, academia. That's what you hear in the entertainment industry, in the mainstream media, in politics. You hear that. That's taken at face value as true by a lot of people. That's not considered radicalization. Now, I think that is radical, but I don't want to see those people censored. I don't need the New York Times doing hit pieces on just that without focusing on all sides of the issue. I choose to debate those people. Leave the best ideas win. I don't need authoritarians saying what I can and can't watch. I'm not going to blame that feminist if someone goes on to become an insane further radical. Mr. Molyneux, who, by the way, I have watched some of his videos, there are things he says that I don't agree with. However, a lot of the things he advocates for that they don't tell you for, one of the things he's most passionate about is not being an abusive parent, never spanking your child, things like that. They briefly mention the idea of like taking responsibility for yourself. How's that a bad thing? That's a great thing. And yes, he's anti-feminist. So am I. I'm not bigoted. I believe as in much equality as possible between men and women. But I think, much like people like Christina Hoff Sommers, I see tons of problems with how feminism is advocated for today. Mr. Kane was a liberal who cared about social justice, worried about wealth inequality, and believed in climate change. But he found Mr. Molyneux's diatribes fascinating, even when they disagreed. His willingness to address young men's issues directly in a way I'd never heard before, Mr. Kane said. Okay, what's the problem with that? So this person's admitting, I was watching Molyneux, I'm concerned about things like climate change and wealth inequality, and even when I disagree, I say, hey, he's making points about young men's issues. I like that. Well, one, maybe that's an argument for why we shouldn't just demonize anyone making arguments about young men's issues. Because if you do, they'll go further and further down a rabbit hole and maybe get people that you find unsavory. And second, none of that proves that somehow Molyneux's a bad person, or at this point, Kane's a bad person. In 2015 and 16, Mr. Kane delved deeper into YouTube recommendation. He discovered an entire universe of right-wing creators. Now explain to me how this argument being used about, oh, he started with Molyneux and then he ended up wherever he's going to end up, which hilariously is not that bad. How is that any different than like the, what's that? Marijuana? You smoked marijuana at one point? Well, that's a gateway drug, and so now that led you to all this other terrible crap. Many of the New York Times and many establishment places on the left would say that's a bogus argument. Oh, you've smoked cigarettes before? Well, that's a gateway. We need, oh, you've had a beer before? That's a gateway. Except it's even worse than that because we're talking about ideas. You should. I listen all the time to creators. I listen to people like the Young Turks. I listen to Rachel Maddow, Don Lemon, Chris Cuomo. I listen to them all the time. Because you shouldn't just listen to arguments from your side or from one side. Sometimes, once in a blue moon, they've said something that I'm like, yeah, that's a good point. Maybe change my perspective a little. Here's a 48-hour snapshot of what he watched one day in 2015. Now, I found this to be very interesting. So, I'm not going to know all these people, but I'll know some of them. So, Stefan Nolan, the market value of female sexuality. What pisses me off about the Oregon shooting and Chris versus Harper. Now, look what you see here. A 2-day sample of his history shows how steeped he was in far-right commentary from people like Molyneux and Paul Joseph Watson. They don't say what makes them far-right. They don't say exactly what they dislike about those commentators. They just insinuate that somehow the fact that this guy watched all these videos in this day proves they're terrible people somewhere. So, there you can see some of them. Another Stefan Molyneux video. Stefan Molyneux's epic fail. I don't know what that would have been. Something on Gamergate. Gamergate, for those of you who don't know, is where the kind of this idea of political correctness and social justice and feminism came into the gaming media. And so they started putting pressure on gaming companies to have a more feminist agenda. And basically a bunch of gamers were saying, this is garbage. We deserve an honest, independent press like you would want to see for any other issue. That's what Gamergate was. Somehow that's considered like alt-right or far-right, and just because you would be interested in that doesn't mean you're a bigot or anything. Moving on, we got Metal Gear Solid. There he took a video of Bud Dwyer, who was a politician's suicide. Okay, how does that right-wing? Suicides on TV. Teens promising Illuminati. Joseph Watson. But you can see. Now, here's one I really want to point out. Gad Saad, who's someone I really like, he's a professor that talks kind of the absurdities of a lot of these cultural Marxism or the social justice warrior type group. Here's Karen Strawn, who's a woman that talks about the dangers of indoctrinating people with feminism and the problems with that. A conversation she had with Gad Saad. Look at the type above it. He viewed conspiracy theories about graphic violence, including a clip of politician's 1987 suicide. What does that have to do with Professor Saad? Nothing. But he's being smeared as part of this somehow. Fiamengo, she calls herself, and I'm quoting, the factual feminist. She's just talks about how we need to focus on young boys and a lot of feminism's gone overboard. But she totally supports equal rights for women. I've seen her be silenced on campus by liberals. But she's the extremist, the factual feminist. And you could just see more. We don't have to go through them all, but you could start to get the idea. By the end of the binge, Mr. Kamen watched explicitly racist videos, including some from channels that have since been banned. Like, blacks are more racist than whites now, I guess. Racist whites by... Yeah. Yeah, and so here's the only one that the title implies actual racism. Racist whites buy black Kuna car after seeing him walk 21 miles to work each day. But I don't know. They say the whites are racist. Yes, it uses sort of a racial slur. I don't know. What does that video have to do with any of the other videos that he watched? Any nut, what they're into? I saw, for example, and you see this play out a lot of times, this guilt by association. David Duke and Donald Trump. David Duke and Donald Trump. David Duke and Donald Trump. Dukes came out and endorsed Ilhan Omar because he found that her statements against Jews were something that he could get behind. Does that mean that I think Ilhan Omar should be smeared as David Duke? No. It's ridiculous. We shouldn't judge people because some nut watched their content. And again, they tried to do this the other day with Ben Shapiro. Someone like vandalized a mosque. They tried to say, he listened to Ben Shapiro. Ben Shapiro, who's one of the most political practicing Jews, I'm sure that if you watched him, you're not getting the message to vandalize mosques. But that's how they tried to, synagogues. Jewish places of worship. Moving on. Every time he watched dozens of clips by Steven Crowder, conservative comedian, Paul Joseph Watson, a prominent right-wing conspiracy theorist who was barred by Facebook this year. He became entranced by Lauren Southern, a far-right Canadian actress who he started referring to as his fasci bae or fascist crush. Now, isn't it funny? Look at how they use this kind of appeal to authority. And this is what you see over and over. It's not that they talk specifically about this is what this particular group's done that we find offensive. Or so what did Paul Joseph Watson do that was so terrible? Instead, they appeal to authorities by saying, Facebook kicked him off. So they just use that as circular logic. One group kicks him off and the other group say, see, that's our justification for kicking him off. It's absurd. These people weren't all shouty demagogues. They were entertainers, building their audience with satirical skits, debates, and interviews with like-minded creators. Debates, highlight that point, right? Some of them were part of the alt-right, a loose cohort of pro-Trump activists who sandwiched white nationalism between layers of internet sarcasm. Others consider themselves alt-light or merely anti-progressive. Again, they're throwing around these terms. Most of these people don't say, by the way, I'm alt-light or I'm alt-right. A lot might say they're anti-progressive, but that doesn't mean that you're connected to any of the previous groups whatsoever. They choose the labels and then smear the label. That's ridiculous. These creators are active on Facebook and Twitter too, but YouTube was their headquarters, a place where they could earn a living by hawking merchandise and any cut of money spent in advertising videos. Few of them had overt ties to establishment conservative groups, and there was little talk of tax cut or trade policy on their channels. Instead, they rallied around issues like free speech and anti-feminism, portraying themselves as truth-telling rebels doing a battle against humorless social justice warriors. The videos felt like episodes in a long-running soap opera with a constant stream of new heroes and villains. Okay, so? Anything unethical about any of that? Do you see much policy discussion in, for example, the New York Times or CNN or MSNBC? Or is it more about conspiracy theories about Donald Trump? And... sensational articles anytime there seems to be white on black racism and things like that. They're playing the game in the inverse. It's okay for the mainstream media to do that. The New York Times to do that's okay. CNN to do that's okay. But when a competing platform does it, they want to call it out. Issues like, notice how they poo-poo, like, they're not talking about policy, they're talking about things like free speech. Yeah, that's kind of the foundational principle of our country. That's why it's the First Amendment. But they act like, just dumb things like free speech they're talking about. Of course the New York Times doesn't find free speech to be a very compelling topic. Because they know free speech leads to competition, which leads to them being out of business. And it also leads to people that they ideologically don't agree with possibly having a chance to have power. They would want total control over information. They want the opposite of free speech. They want speech for only those they agree with. That way they could make more money and have more power. So what is it? Explain to me again in this group. What with this paragraph? What exactly is it that they're vilifying here? To Mr. Kant, this all felt like forbidden knowledge, as if it was by watching some YouTube videos he'd been led into an exclusive club. When I found this stuff, I felt like I was chasing uncomfortable truths. I felt like it was giving me power and respect and authority. Yes, here's the truth, New York Times. When you demonize things like free speech, or when you demonize like being able to criticize a certain thing, like whether it be policies advocating policies geared towards climate change or immigration policies or free speech policies, then you cede that debate to others. You might not like what those others have to say, but guess what? It does feel forbidden. That's why debate, one of the things that turns out that right-wing YouTubers are doing, having debates, is a good thing. That's the opposite of what you're advocating for. Now, moving on. If alienation was one ingredient in Mr. King's radicalization and persuasive partisans like Mr. Molyneux were another, the third was product decisions by YouTube. Now, this is where it starts to talk about the algorithm, and I think I'm going to skip through most of this. But in general, what they're saying here is YouTube basically been tweaking their algorithm and they're trying to get more views. Okay, that's exactly what any company does. They try to get their product out there more. Makes sense. That might not be the best for kind of journalistic integrity. I will agree with that. I'll agree with the New York Times here. The problem is twofold. One, YouTube is supposed to just be a platform, so it's not their business about what's best for journalistic integrity. It's up to you, the consumer, to choose to take in what information you want. For example, let's say you're someone who doesn't like the state of modern movies and you prefer more of the golden age of cinema. You don't then clamor to censor movie studios today because they're making content that you don't like. That content that they're making is what they feel will sell the most. You don't appeal to authority and say, no, that should be shut down based on my whim. Even if you think it would be better for all this violence on movies is bad for the country. Doesn't matter. They're just trying to sell tickets. That's what they're doing. That doesn't make them terrible people. You might not like the decision. Don't watch it. That easy. It's the same with YouTube. They're a platform. They're trying to get more views. They tweak some things. They realize how they get more views. They keep going. Now we're about to see if the trope get woke, go broke applies to YouTube, because they might just start losing people to competitors that actually allow free speech. We shall see. But the second problem with this argumentation is, quite simply, this is exactly what the New York Times and the mainstream media does as well. They've sacrificed journalistic integrity. Heck, even the New York Times, in a brief moment of clarity that was designed to virtue signal and I knew wouldn't be true, came out after the Trump election and said, yes, perhaps some of our coverage of Trump was unfair. They're focused on 2 scoops of ice cream and salacious pee dossiers that were proven to be false. More than they are actual news. They want the sensationalism. And they know this. If you look at when actual journalists are off the record, if they're having their own meetings or something, they'll oftentimes talk about well, we think this is a compelling news story, but we don't think that it'll get clicks. We don't think it'll get views. And the difference is, unlike YouTube or unlike individual content creators like me, I'm not someone who calls myself a journalist. A journalist should have a higher calling. It's supposed to be more about just power and money for them. It's supposed to be, you're supposed to be kind of the bulwark, the information, honesty, truth that's going out to hold people with power accountable. That's what you're supposed to be. It's not supposed to be sensationalist on purpose. But that's what they've become. So once more, we see they are criticizing exactly what they're doing. The difference is they don't want their competitors to get the links. Here we see, I will read this little quote from Laura Southern they put. It's from the White Privilege is a Dangerous Myth. The sexist, racist, homophobic narrative has been blown out of proportion and sensationalized, and everyone knows it. Mr. King turned to videos like this one in late 2015, in part because of how Lauren Southern mocked feminism and social justice warriors. I happen to agree with Laura Southern there. That's why we see things like the Jussie Smollett and the Covington Catholic students, because it's blown out of proportion. That's why we saw things like the Rolling Stone magazine with the UVA rape case. They went, quote, rape shopping for a story because they're trying to push this sensationalist narrative. Now the media says it's somehow bigoted to call the media out on this. That is absurd. So we're going to skip most of this parts of the algorithm. The other thing that they're basically saying, they're making it seem like the right wing, so they're demonizing YouTube themselves, but then they're making it seem like the right wing is uniquely bad because they're exploiting some loophole. Like they're doing something unethical. And basically what the algorithms, it says things that the algorithm's putting for things like to reinforce users that don't have small sound bites and that have an overall longer formats and more character and personality and more humor and more entertainment. Why is that a bad thing? So what? Instead we want the little, and one of the things you hear people, even I've seen Tucker Carlson, for example, when he's being interviewed by Dave Rubin, both of them talk about they love the idea of long form discussions. If you have one person sitting down with one politician and talk to him for an hour, you can actually get in depth into a lot of issues. Whereas on the mainstream media, the little sound bites, whether it be just one article or a little 3-minute segment on Maddow or Hannity or whatever, you don't get that much information. That's where the sensationalism is really drummed up. You're just trying to get out the most sensationalist point you can in the 2 minutes you have to talk. But that's something they're criticizing about this algorithm. Again, because it's a direct competition to them. And why is it that because right-wing people can compete better in that platform, that necessarily means the right-wing people are doing something exploitive or bad? That's absurd. There's nothing bad about the fact that right-wing people tend to be telling more jokes. Just like it wasn't when the left used to tell more jokes. You know, I talk about frequently. I've always been against the idea of censorship. Censorious nature used to come, it seemed, predominantly from the right, whether it been kind of like the enforcement of the comic book code, people like Lenny Bruce being censored in comedians, when you had the big music scare in the early 90s there, where there was attempts to, censor music. That seemed to be coming from the right. I was against that. Now the censorship's coming from mainstream media outlets and more the establishment left. I'm still against it. That doesn't mean that suddenly I've become exploitive or bigoted. It's ridiculous. These right-wing people have been doing a good job on YouTube. Yes, I think a lot of it is because they're putting out a better product on these platforms because they understand it better. That's not shady or unethical. But also, we can't discount that part of it's because there is no outlet for these type of voices in the establishment left-dominated other areas of cultural influence, such as the entertainment industry, the mainstream media, academia. So yeah, you gotta go somewhere. If you're someone who believes in this, even if you want to watch comedy and you turn on late night TV, it's all coming from one place. The humor's coming from a place that wants to be political and mock Trump or be predominantly left-wing. So if you want comedy that's not that, you're going to go to a different platform. That doesn't mean that platform's terrible. That's competition. That's the free market. That's a good thing. Anyways, they go on to say that somehow this... the recommended videos and things of that nature lead to radicalization. This is absurd. You could say the exact same thing about the mainstream media, that the articles they choose to print lead to radicalization and, take any single person, which I'll talk about later, exactly how we could turn the tables on this. So, there's Stefan Molyneux, quote him talking about how the new Star Wars movies or anti-family. Okay, that's his right to say that. That's not radical whatsoever. So, let's go down. By the night of November 8th, 2016, Mr. Kane's transformation was complete. Okay, so here we go. Remember, he set the Glock on the table. Let's see what this monster does. November 8th, 2016. He spent much of the night watching clips of Ms. Clinton's supporters crying after the election was called Mr. Trump's favor. His YouTube viewing history shows that at 1:41 a.m., just before bed, he turned on the live stream hosted by Mr. Crowder with the title, Trump Wins. It felt like a punk rock moment, almost like being in high school again, Mr. Kane said. Okay, so what? Tons of people, including mainstream media people, like to watch and laugh at every single gaffe Trump makes. I, too, relished in the fact that the reactions of the media to Trump winning. Do you want to know why? It wasn't that I voted for Trump, but I did. That had nothing to do with it. It was that journalists that pretend to be independent clearly weren't, and they were showing themselves. And it was funny to see such smug people who discounted Trump. Even if you're not political, it'd be like if you watch, a sporting event where everyone says, the Patriots, 99% chance they win the Super Bowl, and then the Eagles win. Then you turn it on to see, hey, what did all those sports people that were predicted that think? That's part of it, and part of it is that they're clearly not being impartial like they said they were supposed to be. That was my reason for watching it. But that somehow's a bad thing? You think if Trump loses in 2020 that the New York Times will be putting articles about how shameful it was that people turned in to Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity and see how upset they were that Trump lost? Of course not. They'll be right there celebrating, cheering for whoever beats Trump. And that's their right. I don't understand what they're trying to say. Just more transparent attempts showing the bias of this article in the New York Times. That year, Mr. Kane's YouTube consumption had skyrocketed. He got a job packing boxes at a furniture warehouse where he would listen to podcasts and watch videos by his favorite YouTube creators. He fell asleep to YouTube videos at night, his phone propped up on a pillow. Now he watched nearly 4,000 videos in 2016, more than double the number he had watched the previous year. Okay, there's probably a problem with watching that much content of anything. You could be watching soap operas that much, and it's probably not a good thing. But I don't see why that's uniquely bad, that the type of content he was watching. Not all these videos were political. Mr. King's viewing history showed they sought out videos about other interests, including cars, music, cryptocurrency trading, but the bulk of it came from far-right channels. Again, how do they define that? Joe Rogan, Dave Rubin, Intellectual Dark Web, Ben Shapiro, Stefan Molyneux? And after the election, he began exploring a part of YouTube with a darker, more radical group of creators. These people didn't couch their racist and anti-Semitic views in one sarcastic memes, and they didn't speak in dog whistles. By the way, funny that the New York Times would be talking about anti-Semitism, seeing as the cartoons that they ran and had to put apologies out for. Again, why not cast this, superior gaze in the mirror and reflect on yourself? One channel ran by Jared Taylor, the editor of the white nationalist magazine American Renaissance, posted videos with titles like Refugee Invasion and European Suicides. Others posted clips of interviews with white supremacists like Richard Spencer and David Duke. First off, I have watched Jared Taylor videos and Richard Spencer and David Duke, and I completely disagree with them. That's a lot of the reason why I watch them. Instead of just yelling Nazi or bigot, I like to know what they say so that I could properly debate them and show why their ideas are stupid. You want to come at it. If you just make moral arguments, the people that morally disagree with you will never agree with you. You need to be prepared for what they're saying so you can argue logically. Now, of course, if someone's just like, black people are inferior, get them out of here. Yeah, there's nothing really to say. Get them out. But that's not exactly what Jared Taylor said. The idea that there is a refugee invasion and is European suicide, there is a lot of argument as to why the mass influx of quote-unquote refugees, a lot of which are economic migrants, are bad and will actually, and you see even left-wing people saying this, the fact that no one's allowed to talk about it without being called a racist means that you're going to drive more and more people that are just legitimately concerned about what's happening to their society to the far right. So instead of allowing actual debate and instead of cheering for people like the Joe Rogans and the Dave Rubins of the world that actually facilitate these conversations, the New York Times wants to smear them as roads to bigotry, when actually the exact opposite is true. That's the irony of this whole piece. You should be for free speech. You should be against what this whole article was about, regardless of what your politics. But if you're someone just coming from the left, and you're not convinced by any of that, be convinced by this. If your number one rationale is stopping the alt-right and far-right people, know that the best way to do that is to have free speech and to encourage people to have debates and to encourage people like the intellectual dark web that is facilitating these debates between left-wing and right-wing people. And they're willing to talk to someone like a Jared Taylor and have an honest discussion with them. Allow them to get their views out and say, here's why I think you're wrong. The more people hear that, the less they'll become enthralled by, like Kane says here, what was so appealing to him. It was like forbidden knowledge. Exactly. When you censor this stuff and you don't allow any discussion of it, the only people talking about it will be where people go. And those people might be coming from a place of bigotry. That's why you just allow all free speech. That way you can see non-bigots making arguments and show, okay, there's actually nuanced areas to have a discussion. You can have questions and concerns about mass influx of refugees or economic migrants without being a racist. But the New York Times wants to stop their competition. They don't do that. The New York Times doesn't do that. The mainstream media doesn't do that. They want to just scream bigotry because they're ideologues. They're in bed with the establishment left and this sort of mindset. And they don't want their competition. Their competition is getting huge because independent voices that aren't coming from all the same spot is entertaining. People like it. And so they want to take that business out. Whether it be predominantly conservative voices, what you're seeing, or anti-establishment left-wing voices. Both groups are getting affected. That's why if you go on and see, you see tons of people saying all of these history channels on YouTube, not the actual history channel on television, but YouTube channels and creators that have to do with documenting history, like things like World War II, now being demonetized or kicked off YouTube. Why? Well, because they're being lumped in with everyone else. You don't toe the target line, you get the boot. You think the mainstream media is upset about that? Of course not. That's their primary competition. Now, here may be the most crucial paragraph in the entire piece. Listen to this. Mr. Kane never bought into the far right's most extreme views, like Holocaust denial or the need for a white ethno-state. Still, far-right ideology bled into his daily life. He began referring to himself as a tradcon, a traditional conservative, committed to old-fashioned gender norms. He dated an evangelical Christian woman, and he fought with his liberal friends. You know that guy? You know, the first paragraph, he puts a gun on the table. How extreme will he become? He considered himself a traditional conservative. He wanted to talk about gender norms. He dated a Christian. He had arguments with his liberal friends. Are you kidding me? This was the radical that they chose to focus on? How ridiculous can you get? Now think about it. We just saw 2 examples this past week, or this past month. We saw a guy who lit himself on fire in front of the White House and ended up dying. We saw a woman who stabbed herself 10 times because she doesn't want to be in an area where Trump is. Why didn't they? Where's the New York Times contacting people associated with them? Hey, can we see what their YouTube viewing history was? You think they were watching Steven Crowder? You think they were watching Joe Rogan, Dave Rubin? Who knows? Probably watching more things geared towards the left. But they wouldn't dare say, oh, maybe those people read a bunch of New York Times articles. Does that mean that the New York Times has smeared us now insanity on the left? They would say no, that's absurd. So this whole piece about the dangers of radicalization, and the person they shopped around and found didn't even become a radical. He became what he called a traditional conservative. Now the paragraph before says he watched clips of Richard Spencer and David Duke. He watched them and said, I don't buy it. I don't buy the white ethno-state. I'm not a racist. I believe in gender norms. So what? Many people do. I happen to be someone who ran as a Republican, who's a conservative. I have no problem with gay marriage. I have no problem. To me, that's all someone's choice. Government should have no business in it whatsoever. That's my feelings on it. But some people believe in more. I might disagree with that. That doesn't mean they're bigots. That might have something to do with their religion. I disagree with them. Some people have a problem with heteronormativity, with heterosexuals. They're considered an oppressive group. They're demonized. Some people take the idea of getting rid of gender norms too far. And they seek to punish boys in school because they're too hyperactive, because they're engaged in traditional masculine behavior. There's all sorts of people that could be on a huge spectrum of that argument. That doesn't mean he's a terrible person. He didn't go out, doesn't say bully gay people, or he insisted that his girlfriend act like a woman. It didn't say anything like that. That he used violence or hateful rhetoric. No. He argued with his liberal friends. I have plenty of liberal friends I argue with. Guess what? Those liberal friends argued with him as well, I bet. But I don't see them being smeared. Do you see where this is coming from? Oh, well, this traditional conservative, you want to know how bad it got? He argued with the liberal friends. Wasn't that a two-way street? Couldn't you easily make the same article about his liberal friends and say, they watched a lot of Young Turks and Rachel Maddow and Chris Cuomo, and then they ended up arguing with their conservative friends? The guy still had liberal friends, apparently, which further proves that this didn't lead to his radicalization. So he didn't do anything. What's the big crime? Watch YouTube and you may end up arguing with your liberal friends and becoming a traditional conservative. That is alt-right or far-right. That's what this article's saying. Where's the danger again? It was kind of said Zelda Waite, a friend of Mr. Kane's from high school. I was like, wow, what happened? How'd you get this way? Okay, maybe he felt the same with you. Some of Mr. Kane's favorite YouTube creators were shifting their politics too. Molyneux in particular seemed to be veering further to the right. He fixated on race realism, a favorite topic of white nationalism, and went in an InfoWars show to discuss his opposition to multiculturalism with Mr. Jones. He hosted far-right figures on his channel, including Mr. Taylor of American Renaissance and Brittany Pettibone, self-described American nationalist who pushed a Pizzagate conspiracy. Okay. Conspiracy theories, sure. Some are wrong, some could be hurtful. We call out those specifically when they are. One of the things I argue with Pizzagate is you can believe whatever you want and talk about it, but when you're naming people publicly as pedophiles and you don't have proof of that, that's a terrible thing and should be condemned. If you're trying to take physical action because of that, that's a terrible thing and should be punished justly if you commit some crime. But other conspiracy theories include things like the Vietnam War being... Remember the Pentagon Papers? That was a conspiracy theory. How shady a bunch of this stuff going on in Vietnam was. But a bunch of journalists, nonetheless, got information that proved there was a lot of abuses going on called the Pentagon Papers. They won Pulitzer Prizes. Originally, that was a conspiracy theory. So if we allow the government and these oligarchs, tech companies, and media to censor any discussions of that, then we can only take the official story for everything. And that means, guess what? More regime change wars, more bombs in Syria, more overthrowing countries like Libya. Is that what they want? As far as hosting people like Mr. Taylor, that's a white nationalist, he really is a white nationalist. So what? You could have a discussion with him. That's fine. That doesn't make you a bigot. I would happily debate Mr. Taylor. That's what we should be doing. Because, as I said before, when you don't debate them, when you just leave them go over here and it's faux pas to talk about any of that, then the people that have any sort of interest, even if it's in a non-bigoted way, end up listening to the only people talking to them. You shouldn't be trying to silence Mr. Taylor. You should be saying, yeah, we're going to put our best intellectuals up against you and prove your arguments to be nonsense. As far as race realism, this is the idea. I think what they're talking about is IQ differences between certain races. Data shows that a lot of that does exist, but that's just data. What do you do with it makes you the bigot. If you say, therefore, I don't want to live with people of different races, then that's a terrible thing. If you say we need to figure out why these differences exist and how we can improve things, then that's not a terrible thing. But to just say this is a complicated discussion, so it must be bigotry, that's absurd. Multiculturalism, there are problems with multiculturalism. There's a lot of benefits of multiculturalism. When we say we can't discuss the problems or it's racism, then anyone who notices any of these problems and maybe has been affected by it, maybe you're an honest-to-goodness great person who doesn't care where anyone comes from, but you've noticed that in your public school where you send your child, now there's so many people that don't speak English as a first language that they have to be catered to and say your child's not learning as much. You're not a bigot, you just want the best for your child. So you want to talk about that. That doesn't mean you're even against immigration or even illegal immigration. You're just like, hey, I just wanted to talk about this issue. Is there anything we could do to solve this? And people scream, racist, bigot. And then you have people on the far right, like the Jared Taylors, that would say, hey, come talk to me. I agree with you. That is a problem. And here's some of my other thoughts. That's the danger. That's why we should all be engaged in these discussions. As Mr. Molyneux promoted white nationalists, his YouTube channel kept growing. By the way, I've watched a lot of Molyneux. My favorite on there are when he has people on that talk about things like Shakespeare and movies, not in a white nationalist way whatsoever. So to act like that's just what this guy was doing is absurd. That would be no different than saying, which they try to do. If Dave Rubin has a right-winger on they don't like, oh, Dave Rubin's just promoting white or right-wingers. It's absurd. They do a lot of other content as well. He's been watched a lot. Last year, he and Ms. Southern, Mr. King's Fashi Bay, went on a joint speaking tour in Australia and New Zealand where they criticized Islam, discussed what they saw the dangers of non-white immigration. Okay, they're allowed to do that. Are they advocating violence? I haven't heard it. The left, even in the mainstream media, have defended places like Antifa. Carlos Maza, who called for all this, recommended assaulting people with milkshakes. That's somehow not deemed worthy of discussion. But people saying things you disagree with, that's all of a sudden a big deal. In March, after a white nationalist gunman killed 15 Muslims in a pair of mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand, Mr. Molyneux and Ms. Southern distanced themselves from the violence, calling the killer a left-wing eco-terrorist, saying linking the shooting to far-right speech was utter insanity. It absolutely was utter insanity how they tried to spin this. The manifesto clearly outlined first that this person wrote that he was seeking to cause division. And second, it showed that he was basically intentionally blaming both the left and the right wing. So he was saying things like he was a rabid environmentalist. Does that mean that we need to smear everyone concerned about climate change? Absolutely not. Now, I've no doubt that this person was a racist at all. True. Proven. But that doesn't mean that people that talked about dangers of Islam or of economic migrants or refugees are responsible for this shooting. That's absurd. Where was the New York Times piece when a Bernie Sanders supporter went out and shot Steve Scalise and a bunch of other Republicans on a ball field? Did they say, geez, perhaps our coverage of how Trump's a spy and that overturning... That guy said that he was concerned about Obamacare being revoked. New York Times spoke often about how people would die and how the dangers of overturning Obamacare. Does that mean they're responsible for that shooting? Of course not. It was insanity and continues to be insanity how the mainstream media cherry picks. And anyone, by the way, who does this. There could be people on the right that do this as well. They cherry pick when there's a terrible incident that occurs and use that to blame the group that they don't like. So yes, I agree with Molyneux and Southern saying, I don't think that the idea that he was an eco-terrorist that suddenly we should blame environmentalists either, but the idea that it was insanity, at least how they tried to link this to Trump and right-wing figures, I agree. Neither Molyneux or Ms. Southern replied to a request for comment. The day after my request, Molyneux uploaded a video titled An Open Letter to Corporate Reporters in which he denied promoting hatred and violence and said labeling him an extremist was just a way of slandering ideas. Okay, I agree. As social media platforms have barred far-right activists, hate speech, harassment, and other harmful conduct, Molyneux and Southern have become vocal free speech advocates who denounce what they call excessive censorship by social media companies. If you ban or crush people's lawful speech like a rattlesnake, Mr. Molyneux said in a video, you cut off the rattle, but you don't cut off the head. Exactly. That's what I've been saying. That's what this article proves. It proves that someone could watch these videos, not become an extremist, that debate's important, and when people are censored and when the ideas are censored, it becomes forbidden knowledge. Finishing up here. In 2018, nearly 4 years after Mr. Kane began watching right-wing videos, a new kind of video began appearing in his recommendation. These videos were made by left-wing creators, but they mimicked the aesthetics of the right-wing YouTube, down to competitive titles and a mocking use of words like triggered and snowflake. Enjoyment of Beethoven or white babies or whatever you get off was in no way impeded by the proximity of people with different skin colors. Decrypting the alt-right, how to recognize a fascist, from ContraPoints. Mr. McCain says Natalie Wynn, a former academic philosopher who makes left-wing YouTube videos, used humor, shot in a style unlike right-wing creators, to get his attention. Okay, so the left's doing the exact same thing as the right. And you'll see, the New York Times says that's a good thing. That's good. So when the right does it, it's terrible and horrible. When the left just says how to recognize a fascist, right? No overly call people bigots, fascists, things like that, using the exact same type of rhetoric, that's a good thing. Now, finally, the problem solved. He went from an evil traditional conservative to a great, loving, left-wing person. Ridiculous. One video was a debate about immigration between Ms. Southern and Steve Bunnell, a liberal YouTuber known as Destiny. Mr. Kane watched the video to cheer on Ms. Southern, but Bunnell was a better debater, and Mr. Kane declared him the winner. Kane found videos by Natalie Wynn, who I talked about. Wynn wore elaborate costumes, did drag-style performance, in which she explained why Western culture wasn't under attack for immigrants or why race was a social construct. Now, talking about the debate, yes, debate is a good thing. I believe that oftentimes, at least what we've seen recently, is the right-wing people are more willing to debate than a lot of these establishment left. That's why you see more attempts of censorship on campuses trying to keep right-wing speakers out. But that's not to say on any particular issue someone from the left couldn't be a better debater than someone on the right. That's great. That's what we should want. This gentleman was able to change his mind because he saw a conversation between someone on the right and someone on the left. Great. Let the best idea win. I haven't seen the particular debate he talked about. I don't know how it went. I don't know that either Mr. Bunnell or Ms. Southern are the best people to advocate their positions. But nonetheless, that's what we want, a free exchange of ideas. Let each individual decide which group they thought did a better job and let that shape their ideas. Whether it change them or help buttress their own, whatever. That's a great thing. That's not the censorship, though, that places like Fox and the New York Times are calling for. Unlike most progressives, Mr. Kane had seen take on the right. Mr. Bunnell and Ms. Wynn were funny and engaging. They spoke the native language of YouTube. They didn't get outraged by far-right ideas. Instead, they rolled their eyes at them and made them seem shallow and unsophisticated. I noticed that right-wing people were taking these old-fashioned knee-jerk reactionary politics and packing them as edgy punk rock, Ms. Wynn told me. One of my goals was to take the excitement out of it, which is reasonable. That's great. You see people getting a message out there and you say, hey, they're gearing it towards an audience that we're not. Maybe we should try to gear towards that. That's perfectly reasonable. Now, if you have integrity, you should be doing so in a way that you feel is truthful and honest. But of course, adding humor and comedy, that's fine. We see the mainstream do it all the time. That's why SNL is constantly going after Trump. That's why SNL is endorsing Hillary Clinton. That's why you have all these entertainers that are out there saying, hey, vote for Hillary, vote Donald Trump for office. Because the idea that they're entertaining and they have this message. Now, as consumers, we should understand that just because someone's entertaining doesn't mean that they have a more superior knowledge of a particular philosophical or political position. But I don't begrudge people trying to get more viewership for their positions by being fun. That's great. It wasn't a problem when the right did it. It's not a problem when the left does it. When Mr. Kane first saw these videos, he dismissed them as left-wing propaganda. You mean how New York Times is dismissing the Crowders of the world as right-wing propaganda? But he watched more and started to wonder if people like Ms. Wynn had a point. Her videos persuasively used research and citations to about the right-wing talking points he had absorbed. I don't know about Ms. Wynn. I hope she is using research and citations and factual evidence. That would be great. Many times the same people they're criticizing on the right, or not even the right, but just criticize, such as Joe Rogan, Dave Rubin, the intellectual dark web, even Molyneux, they use citations as well. I just kept watching more and more of the content, sympathizing and empathizing with her, and also seeing that, wow, she really knows what she's talking about, Mr. Kane said. Ms. Wynn and Mr. Bunnell are part of a new group of YouTubers who are trying to build a counterweight to YouTube's far-right flank. This group calls itself BreadTube, a reference to the left-wing anarchist Peter Copting's book, The Conquest of Bread. It also includes people like Oliver Thorne, a British philosopher who hosts the channel PhilosophyTube, where he posts videos about topics like transphobia, racism, and Marxist economies. Oh, okay. So the right wing's radical. Oh, they're terrible on YouTube. But a left wing that takes its name from an anarchist book. You know what anarchy is? Overthrow all government. That's considered cool. That's on the up and up. Do you see the insanity of this? This is how far we've come. Labeling centrists and anyone to the right as dangerous, leading to extremism, bigots, misogynist. And then when we have the left come in, admittedly by YouTube, basically imitate everything they saw, all those people on the right that they said were all those terrible things, except be on the left and take their influence from an anarchist who would like to see the overthrow of the government, that's pushing things like Marxist economics, because that's never gone wrong. And they should be. I'm not cheering for their censorship. That's fantastic. It's just showing the insanity and the hypocrisy of this. The core of BreadTube's strategy is kind of algorithmic hijacking. By talking about many of the same topics far-right creators do, and in some cases by responding directly to the videos, left-wing YouTubers are able to get their videos recommended to the same audience. That's fine. That's smart. There's nothing... For some reason, this is deemed okay by the left-wing, but they thought it was terrible when the recommendations were showing right-wing voices. Natalie and Destiny made a bridge over to my side, Mr. Kane said, and it was interesting and compelling enough that I walked across it. BreadTube's small, Ms. Wynn, the most prominent figure in the movement, has about 615,000 subscribers. Small fraction drawn by the largest right-wing creators. Unfortunately, the alt-right got a big head start in finding ways to appeal to white men, said American Johnson, YouTuber who runs a left-wing channel called Non-Compete. We're late to the party, but I think we'll build a narrative that will stand strong against alt-right narrative. This is absurd. They're going to label people like Crowder and all them. They're alt-right, they're racist, they're bigots, right? But then they're imitating the thing. If I was to say, all the racist, the anti-white racist on these channels, people would say, no, that's ridiculous. After the New Zealand shooting, Mr. Kane decided to try to help. He recently started his own YouTube channel, Faraday Speaks, homage to the 19th century scientist Michael Faraday, where he talks about politics, current events from a left-wing perspective. He shows young men a way out of their far right before more white nationalist violence ensues. Again, they label it was far-right white nationalist violence. They're going to talk specifically about that. They don't talk about the Scalise shooting. They don't talk about all sorts of other shootings that occur when it's not white people. Right? We just got to counter this one. That's kind of what we're talking about. That's some of the appeal. When the mainstream media only focuses on that, then you're going to have those other areas of discussion occur somewhere. They're coming in a place where independent creators can have content on that platform. You have to reach people on their level, and part of this is edgy humor, edgy memes. You have to empathize with them, and then you have to give them space to get all these ideas out of their head. Shortly after his first video was uploaded, Mr. Kane began receiving threats from alt-right trolls on 4chan. One called him a traitor and made a reference to hanging him. That was where he bought the gun. Several weeks ago, he moved out of West Virginia and is working a new job while he develops his channel. That's terrible. Threats are always bad, but they happen to right-wing people as well as left. Again, they're only giving half of the story here. And by the way, good for this person, but it does seem like he's a little impressionable, right? It became such a big part of his life when the right-wing did it, and then when the left does the exact same stuff, now it's such a big part of his life on the left. But hey, if he's happy, great. Is the New York Times going to do a story if he comes out 3 years from now and says, geez, these left-wing people are radicalizing me. They started talking about how all men are toxic, or, how all this cultural Marxism where we have to look just at the world through identity politics, and it leads to all sorts of shady things where we're belittling people based just on their skin color, like the Covington Catholic kids. Will they do a piece if he comes to that conclusion in 2-3 years? Somehow I think not. What's most surprising about Mr. Kane's new life on the surface is how similar it feels to his old one. He still watches YouTube videos every day, hangs on the words of his creators. It's difficult at times to tell where YouTube stops and where his personality begins. Perhaps it shouldn't be a surprise. Our political culture is now built largely on shape-shifting internet platforms, which have made flipping partisan allegiances as easy as changing hairstyles. It's possible that vulnerable young men like Mr. Kane will drift away from radical groups as they grow up and find stability elsewhere. It's also possible this whiplash polarization is here to stay and political factions gain and lose traction online. Near the end of our interview, I told Mr. Kane I found it odd that he successfully climbed out of the right wing only to jump into left wing YouTube. I asked if he considered cutting back on videos altogether. Of course, I wonder if he's considered cutting back on his consumption of mainstream media, which also leads to this exact same polarization. Isn't it funny, once more, how the New York Times doesn't cast that gaze upon themselves and talk about the damage they could do and the division that they cause? But when it's their direct competition, all of a sudden they're high and mighty. He hesitated and looked slightly confused. For all of its problems, he said, YouTube's still where political battles are fought and won. Leaving the platform would essentially mean abandoning the debate. He conceded, though, he needed to think critically about the videos he watched. YouTube's a place to put out a message, but I've learned now that you can't go to YouTube and think that you're getting some kind of education because you're not. Very great way to end it, right? A warning. Don't think you're getting educated on YouTube. For that, you have to come to the New York Times and the mainstream media. Now, here's the little exception they put at the bottom. The Times blurred one image into a 48-hour timeline because of its explicit nature. Kevin Roos is a columnist. Graphics and production by other people. This is some of the worst journalism I've seen. And keep in mind, here's the high points of it. It's not just something that the New York Times, just some opinion editor did and they didn't really endorse it. It was on the front page of their print edition. They intentionally smeared people that would by no means identify themselves as far or alt-right, and in fact, some of which would identify themselves as centrist or leftist. They start out sensationalist way, the same way they're criticizing YouTube videos, the right-wing YouTubers, by talking about a gun being put on the table. They put a bunch of pictures up with words like misogyny, racist, bigot, Nazi, white nationalism, with faces behind it that don't match up whatsoever. They talk about how dangerous this person is and how it led to his extremism, when at the end of the day, even after watching racist videos, he never became a racist, and the worst he did was become a traditional conservative, date a Christian girl, and argue with his liberal friends. They know that this is only half the story, and there are people that are liberal that we could look through their YouTube videos and be able to see exactly the type of content they are watching. So they selectively took one person who they couldn't even pick a good person to show that he did something horrible and extreme. They picked a person, said that he was brainwashed because he's now admittedly a left-wing person that has every incentive to say that, and then showed all these people that he watched, smearing them all as possible, leading to extremism, when they could have done that with literally any group. You could find people that have done crazy stuff that read the New York Times every day, but they chose not to look at that. And they're going after their biggest competitor, the internet creator community, led by YouTube. And of course, YouTube has already started to capitulate. And predictably, we see what that censorship's leading to. And the last thing is, we know that when you censor ideas like this, it gives it sort of a forbidden knowledge aspect, and it drives people to the most extreme. The best way to stop people from becoming extremists would be if places like the New York Times would stop being such a one-voiced gatekeeper that called everyone they didn't agree with bigots and wanted to censor those points of views. So all in all, this is one of the worst pieces, and it's important because you have to understand two things. It's important because, one, it's because this is primarily hitting conservatives, you can only silence people so much. They already control all of these other public areas of influence. The mainstream media, academia, the entertainment industry. Now, if you start to silence voices here, where will they go? And you can only push that division so long until worse things will start to happen. There'll be more real-world division, which will be bad. We need to be allowing debate even if we disagree. That's the best way to come together. Things like humor help with that. Even if you're a rabid Trump supporter, the best chance that you have, some of the best chances you have to maybe hear arguments from the other side come through places like comedy. We understand that. Yet they act like it's something terrible that these right-wing YouTubers are using comedy and entertainment. Okay. And the other thing is to understand that all of us, regardless if we're on the left, the right, or whatever, need to stop this idea of censorship. It used to be a very liberal left-wing idea to try to get as many voices as possible and to not allow gatekeepers to control our access to information. If we lose the battle for the internet and free speech on there, then it's a detriment to all of us. Inevitably, we'll start to see a situation just like we see in mass journalism where a handful of corporations control all of our free thought. That'll affect all right-wing people, all left-wing people. And so we need to take these sorts of challenges seriously and point out the insanity and the terrible journalism that's going on in an effort to attack their competitors. I know this was a long video. Thanks for sticking with me. If you like this content, please like and subscribe. I try to put out videos almost daily. I do a live stream on my friend DroneCheck's channel every Saturday night at 7 p.m. And I do a live stream every Thursday night at 7 p.m. on my channel here. So if you like, again, please like and subscribe. Thank you, everyone, and have a good one.